Hare Krishna. Jaya Jaya Shri Jaya. Jai Nitya Lila Pravishna Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Prevrajikacharya Stotra Shada Shri Srimadabhaya Charanaravindra Bhakti Vedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Nitya Lila Pravishna Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Prevrajikacharya Stotra Shada Shri Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Shri Gauriya Vaishnav Guru Varga Ki Jai. Ganga Mai Ki Jai. Jamuna Mai Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Tulsi Devi Ki Jai. Srila Namacharya Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai. Srila Krishna Das Kaviraj Thakur Ki Jai. Shri Chaitanya Charitamrita Ki Jai. All glories to Assembly devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to Assembly devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to Assembly devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pashtai Putare Srimati Radha Govinda Goswami Namine Namaste Prabhupada Devam Gauravani Pacharade Dirvishashanyavadi Kramya Jana Nishtarini. It's cold today. So today we are beginning chapter 2 of Madhya Lila. We concluded chapter 1 yesterday, and yeah, a bit better. Jai. So we concluded chapter 1 yesterday. The very, very end of chapter 1, we didn't really go over too much, but the end of chapter 1, at the very, very end of the summary, which we discussed in one of the first few days, is essentially a very brief overview. It's not as systematic as the overview of Madhya Lila is. It's various pastimes of Antya Lila that are put not so much in chronological order. So things like the chastisement of Chota Haridas, the disappearance of Haridas Thakur, and the Gambhira pastimes, various other elements of Antya Lila, of the pastimes are discussed. However, in chapter 2, there is, again, not so much a concern of the pastimes of Antya Lila, but there is a strong delving into the actual mood of Antya Lila. When Ghanesham Prabhu asked me to do the CC classes, the Chaitanya Charitamrita classes, chapter 2 was the one that I was most worried about doing, because these things, when they appear in Antya Lila, at least there's been a ramp building up to them, into these various things. But here, normally, so as we are approaching these great sort of esoteric, intense things, there's the whole ramp and building up of Madhya Lila, and then of course some greater contextual elements in Antya Lila in order to sort of soften the intensity. But chapter 2, trying to take the intensity and the essence of that mood, sort of just dives into it very directly. So chapter 2 discusses a lot of very elevated topics, in the sense that it is a real exploration of the internal moods that Mahaprabhu felt. As we know, Madhya Lila, in a sense, is the searching and discovery of those moods, but Antya Lila is the relishing of them. So, to begin off, I'll write out a general conception of chapter 2. It can be broken into 2 sections, one much larger than the other. The first section, part 1, is really the description of the ecstasies and pastimes of Mahaprabhu. So we have the first 14 texts. These ones describe mainly the ecstasies and the bodily transformations of Mahabhav and the other things Mahaprabhu was experiencing. So here's the ecstasy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Then as a little subsection of that, not so much a separate section, but to go into depth, this here is a description of Mahaprabhu's behaviors, but then starting from text 15, so I'll nest that inside, like Python indentation. Then text 15 to 75, they discuss nine central verses that are spoken by Mahaprabhu in his ecstasy. These 9 verses now we're hearing, so in the first 14 there's sort of a build-up explaining what his behaviors were like. From 15 to 75, which as you can see takes a great fraction of this chapter, there is a description of what are the actual words that were being used to describe that heart and mood of Mahaprabhu. Most of these are in Sanskrit, one is in Prakrit. Prakrit itself isn't actually a language. Sometimes people will refer to it as its own language, but it's more a body of languages. It's just because none of them are too popular on their own. They're sort of lumped together and referred to as Prakrit. A famous example of one Prakrit that's not lumped in would be Pali, which is what most Buddhist texts are written in. But I'll get more into it when we get to that text. But the Prakrit languages were essentially the middle point between Sanskrit and the modern Indian languages like Hindi and Bengali. So the Prakrit that Mahaprabhu speaks in seems to be one that seems to be Sanskrit slowly developing in the direction of like Orissa and Assamese Bengali, that sort of thing. So there's 9 of these texts. When we get up to that, they specifically are texts 18, 28, 36, 42, 45, 58, 61, 65, and 74. So these are the 9 verses which Mahaprabhu is, and the rest are Bengali elaborations by Mahaprabhu on those actual texts. So each one captures, and when we get up to it, we'll talk about how each one captures a different element of philosophy, or rather the emotion, the experience of various elements of philosophy in Mahaprabhu's ecstasies. And then Mahaprabhu goes on and elaborates on them. So, and these are the more esoteric parts, because all of these are taken from the perspective of Radharani. As we know, the whole point of Mahaprabhu Leela is Krishna is trying to forget what it means to be Krishna, and he wants to try to understand what it means to be Radharani. Here we find that. But that is, again, a very elevated topic, so that is why this is the more intense section. Then for texts 76 to 83 is further descriptions of the ecstasy, position, and activities of Mahaprabhu. So we go back to that outer layer to further description. Then for the second and smaller part, but still very relishable and interesting, then because this is then the conclusion of the summary the Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur is presenting in these first 2 chapters. So then as we come to part 2 itself is the conclusion of this summary. Here we see Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur. He is saying, I've concluded my overall summary for the CC, and then he sort of gives a little introduction. So when we get into that, that's a perfect little segue into then chapter 3. And chapter 3 is when, in depth, the pastimes begin to be discussed. So this second part is a discussion, again, it's a conclusion of what has happened in the summary, and it's a description, a sort of meta description of the CC from the perspective of Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur. Texts 84 to 88 are describing the glories and qualities of this Chaitanya Charitamrita. And then texts 89 to 92 are a justification for why Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur has given this summary so early on. And then texts 93 to 95, which conclude the introductory section before we jump into the full-fledged pastimes, is a paying respect or a pranam to the Supreme Lord and his devotees. So this is an overview of chapter 2. Hopefully, I'm not sure how long it'll take to get through it, but this is essentially how it'll go through. And unlike chapter 1, I'll just go in order through these ones. So we'll begin with the first 14 texts. And in these first 14 texts, we hear, again, Mahaprabhu has gone to the Gambhira, in the Gambhira. And the Gambhira is a sort of a separate area where Mahaprabhu chose to relish his pastimes. So, here we see Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur is saying, I shall describe the Lord's transcendental ecstasy, which appears like madness due to a separation from Krishna. All glories to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, all glories to Lord Nityananda, all glories to Advaita Chandra, and all glories to all the devotees of the Lord. During his 12 years, Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu always manifested all the symptoms of ecstasy in separation from Krishna. Again, as we were discussing when we were looking at the overview of chapter 1, the heights of the ecstasies of Srimati Radharani, the most intense forms of her love, are in separation. So here we see the different ways that his mind and his body and all of his being are being affected by these pains of separation. Ms. Mahaprabhu's state of mind, day and night, was practically identical to Radharani's state of mind when Uddhava came to Vrindavan to see the gopis. We'll discuss that a little later. I'll first go over the mood that Mahaprabhu is having. So he had a state of mind reflecting the madness of his separation. All his activities were based on forgetfulness, and his talks were always based on madness. So they're his activities and talks. His activities are now based purely on forgetfulness, and his talks are madness. His blood is flowing from all the pores of his body, and his teeth are being loosened. At one moment, his whole body became slender, and at another moment, his whole body became fat. And then here we have the description. The small room beyond the corridor is called the Gambhira. Mahaprabhu used to stay in that room, but he did not sleep for a moment, so there his sleep is being affected. Now he is not sleeping anymore. All night, now we hear how his mouth and his head are being affected. Because he used to grind his mouth and his head all over the walls and would sustain severe injuries. And then although three doors of the house were always closed, the Lord would nonetheless go out and sometimes be found at the Jagannath temple before the gate known as Singhadwar. The Singhadwar, that is the eastern gate that we were discussing when we were talking about Patita Pavana. So that is where the deity of Patita Pavana is placed. So this is where the first tradition that I mentioned, of the 4 traditions of how that deity manifested, the first tradition, which said that it appeared due to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's strong hankerings, this is where that seems to have its foundation. And Ms. Mahaprabhu was waiting out at the Singhadwar, which is again that eastern gate. And then we go on. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu would also run very fast across the sand dunes, mistaking them from Govardhan. He would wail and cry loudly. He would mistake the small parks of the city for Vrindavan. He would go there, dance and chant, and sometimes fall unconscious in spiritual ecstasy. The extraordinary transformations of the body due to transcendental feelings would never have been possible for anyone but the Lord, in whose body all transformations were manifested. This text right here is very important. Prabhupada here condemns, as he often does, the Sahajiyas, and rightfully so. The Sahajiyas and the Mayavadis are Prabhupada's, I would say, 2 most favorite people to condemn, and for very good reason. We'll discuss, I think, maybe tomorrow or the day after. It's described in the previous chapter. Prabhupada actually gives a list of 11 Upper Sampradayas which are built on Sahajiya principles. So maybe tomorrow we'll go through a rough history of each one, because of course we use this word Sahajiya a lot, and we don't use it incorrectly, but it is the best way to identify a problem is to know the details of it. Because actually each one of the different Upper Sampradayas, they've stemmed from maybe original misconceptions which on their own wouldn't seem so glaring, wouldn't seem so bad. The Bhaktivinoda Thakur, I believe, said that actually every Upper Sampradaya begins when an adjustment that is made for specific time, place, and circumstance is treated as a universal adjustment. When this happens, then by not understanding the proper mood of something, a tiny mistake will be adopted, and then if one goes even 1 degree off course, then how many kilometers down the road, the difference between where they wanted to go and where they ended up is very far away. So a study of the various Apasampradayas, the various types of sahajiyas and all, is somewhat beneficial. So we'll go over tomorrow, maybe, or the day after. We'll see how long it takes to get to there. We'll go over these various types of sahajiyas. But here we find Srila Prabhupada, he is mentioning that the sahajiyas will try to imitate these things. But Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur, he is saying these things can only happen in the body of the Supreme Lord. Actually, this is further explained when it is described that we go back home, back to Godhead. Some people think that, you die and then you go off into Vaikuntha, straight there. You go immediately there, you're a gopi or a gopa or a blade of grass, whatever you ended up, or maybe you're in a Vaikuntha planet, depending how you cultivated your spiritual life. But you go straight there. And maybe that's true if you're going to the Vaikuntha planets. Then you might be taken on a spiritual skyliner and head off. However, when one goes to Goloka Vrindavan, it is generally described, because of course we know Krishna's leelas, they are prakata and aprakata. There is the prakat leela, which is the leela manifested on earth, and there's the aprakat, which is the nitya, the eternal leelas in the spiritual world in Goloka Vrindavan. That being said, even though the pastimes in the eternal world are eternal, also the pastimes in the material world are also eternal. Prabhupada very famously uses that analogy. Krishna's pastimes are like the sun. When the sun is setting for us, it is rising for someone else. In the same way, the Prakat Leela, the Leelas on the earth, are always happening in some universe. They only happen in our universe in one day of Brahma. In one day of Brahma, we get Mahaprabhu in only one specific Kali Yuga. Once in a day of Brahma do we get Mahaprabhu, the full Srimad Bhagavatam, and Krishna, which is why we are so fortunate to be in this Kali Yuga. But then he will do it in some other universe, which is then their special blessed Kali Yuga. When this happens, so it is then understood that actually a devotee, when they leave their body, if they are on the stages of bhava or prema, they will not take birth directly in Goloka Vrindavan, in the Aprakat Leela. Actually, they will take birth in a Prakat Leela in whichever universe Krishna is currently present in. And there are two reasons generally given. The first given is that in the Golok Vrindavan, in the Aprakat Leela, they are not getting born. They are eternally experiencing there is a memory of the birth and all, but the eternal pastimes there are continuously Navakishore. They're constantly at one age. So it's a bit awkward if one appears without having the memories or experiences of growing up. So in order for this to happen, they are born in the Prakat Leela, and then they are growing up alongside Krishna, Radharani, Shubal, Shridham, all of the other associates in Vraj, so then they can learn their role, they can learn their position. But not only do they learn in the idea of having the life experiences, but they also then learn. We know Krishna Prem is the 9th level of devotion. But we also know there's higher levels. There's beyond that, there's Sneha, Raga, Anuraga, Bhava, and Mahabhav. There's a few others, I've mind blanked now. But these are further ones. But these ones cannot be fully experienced in our bodies. These bodies that we have right now, even if they're spiritualized by devotional service, as it is mentioned here, it is not that people can so cheaply experience these things. The things we are reading here, how can our bodies do these things? Having our teeth go like that. But these are all things that Srimati Radharani herself experienced, and to some degree, devotees can also experience. But we cannot experience them in these bodies. So therefore, that birth is taken there so that this development into those higher levels again of prem can occur. So for these two reasons, when a devotee who has through the method of going back to Goloka Vrindavan, not necessarily another planet, because of this reason, they will take birth in wherever Krishna is incarnating for his Prakat Leela. And then when all of the denizens of Raj get pulled into Goloka Vrindavan, then they enter into the Aprakat Leela. So for this reason, because again, as Prabhupada has said, our bodies cannot manifest these things, but people will make a great show of them. There is a pastime of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, as we know, he was called the 7th Goswami. But the title, the 7th Goswami, wasn't actually given to him initially by the devotee community. It was given probably by a devotee, but it was not given in devotional circles. It was actually given in a newspaper article about Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Then, of course, the devotees adopted it. when it was given, this reflects that if it was given in a newspaper article, Bhaktivinoda Thakur had some fame, some well-respect as a devotee of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. With this fame, he was sometimes asked to open or to attend plays depicting the life of Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And there was one that was being performed, and it was known that actually the actor portraying Mahaprabhu, or one of Mahaprabhu's associates, was actually a prostitute. One of the, we know that prostitutes in those times were slightly different. They were also well trained in the arts, which is why she was seen as qualified by the person who was composing the drama to do so. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, when he was invited to go, obviously said no, and he spoke rather harshly that this is complete blasphemy. Not only is this blasphemy, but this is foolishness. What can you portray of Mahaprabhu with these actors? It is not something to be acted. However, at the time, there was another famous spiritualist, Ramakrishna, and he was invited instead. Because they could not get Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who was famous for following Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. They thought, okay, we'll get somebody else who's at least famous. So Ramakrishna attended, and then he watched the whole thing, and the whole time, everyone there, they were completely absorbed. Wow, look at this wonderful depiction of Krishna Prem. And even Ramakrishna, seeing this prostitute and these other actors who had no knowledge of spiritual life, he was completely absorbed. And it was said he actually went afterwards to the actress and he said, "You are so blessed to be able to so wonderfully depict the glories of spiritual love." And then she got embarrassed and said, no, I'm just acting. And he said, no, truly, you must have some spiritual understanding, because who could make such emotions enter into our hearts? We are all now in love with this idea of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu because of your acting. But they are not in love with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. If nothing, this could be compared to Pondrak. This would maybe be a Pondrak Mahaprabhu. This would be a very, very different type. But so many people, they are infatuated with these false sort of displays of emotion. But that is all they are. They are acting. That is not to say that they don't necessarily exist. They do occur, as we mentioned. So, because of this, there is an emphasis that such things are not what we should look out for. It is not that, again, as I was speaking yesterday on the purport of the Bhagavad Sandarbha, is that this is not sentimentalism, spiritual life. If one just looks for all of these things, many people in India, they're being tricked by many false gurus. And many people will sometimes say, this is so damning of all these false gurus. This is, these terrible people are cheating these people. But the fact of the matter is, the reason why there are so many cheating gurus is because a huge proportion of the people in India want to be cheated. They want nothing more than the sentimentalism. And if they do not have the sincerity to sincerely seek for something which is spiritual, then there is an audience, there is a demand for the supply of all of this bogus transcendentalism. So if sentimentalism, if this is made, if magic tricks and cool theatrics are made the standards for what we see Vaishnav Thakur, for what we see the sadhu to be, then we will be bewildered. Madhavananda Prabhu, he often gives the example of one Mataji he met once. And he was speaking a seminar on Guru Tattva. And he was speaking to her and he was explaining the great qualifications for the great Vaishnava. And he was saying all these things. And then that Mataji at the end, she said, "Yes, I chose my spiritual master because he is good with children." This is not a proper criteria. And many people, maybe they will see that and they'll realize, okay, that's maybe a faulty criteria. But then they will become bewildered by all these other criteria. But Srila Prabhupada here, he's very wonderfully illustrating, as that pastime as well of Bhaktivinoda Thakur is illustrating, that it is not these outward shows that define spirituality. And then we hear the joints of his hands and legs would sometimes become separated by 8 inches, and they remained connected only by the skin. Sometimes Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's hands, legs, and head would all enter within his body, just like the withdrawn limbs of a tortoise. In this way, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu used to manifest wonderful ecstatic symptoms. His mind appeared vacant, and there were only hopelessness and disappointment in his words. So this is a description, again, of this great and exalted ecstasy. And we read I know I said I'll go through in order, but I'm actually going to skip over the 9 verses now. There is a description in the further description that Mahaprabhu, he was doing all of these things, and he was also relishing various literatures, like Gita Govinda, and text by Ramananda Rai. All of these elevated and high shastras. And people will see this, and then they will say, haha, gotcha. You're telling me that I need to hear all these things about Dhruva Maharaj. You're telling me I need to hear all of these other ideas about the glories of Bhagavan. Here, I am aspiring to taste these high things. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is not tasting these moods of Radharani. He is not tasting these by reading all of these by reading Bhagavad Gita. He's not tasting these by reading Ishopanishad. He's tasting these things by reading Gita Govinda. But we should remember that Mahaprabhu, when he would hear Bhagavatam being spoken by Gadadhar Pandit, before all these things happened, in his earlier days, Gadadhar Pandit would speak Bhagavad Katha to him. And what would he hear? He heard certain sections hundreds of times. These sections weren't the Ras Leela, they weren't Brahmar Gita, they weren't Venu Gita, they weren't Gopi Gita. What they were, it was the pastimes of Dhruva Maharaj and Prahlad Maharaj. It is through the passing through of these things that a qualification may come. And many people, again, they will make a show with all of these books. There was a disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur who sort of went off and did his own thing. Sometimes it's forgotten that just in the same as in ISKCON, we have the fringes. We have devotees who are, they're associated with ISKCON, but they're not necessarily under any temple authorities. They're not so strongly engaging the communities. They exist out on the fringes. So this devotee was like that, and he was out on the fringes, but he was out in the fringes in Radha Kund. And being there, some of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's disciples, they spoke to him and they said, this god brother of ours, he is so elevated. He is so exalted. He is in Radha Kund, and what he is saying, he's saying Radhe, 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 Radhe. He is so elevated that he no longer has the need to say the Mahamantra. He is only taking Radha Naam. That is what they were saying, and they were very impressed by this, and they were telling Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, hearing this, he said, okay, that is fine. Maybe that is his conception. Okay, let him do that. But I would like to instruct you in something even more rasic, something even more elevated than the chanting of Radha's name. Because in the Brahma Vaivarta Purana, it says that when one chants the name of Radharani, who comes? Krishna comes. Because hearing the name of Radha, he is hearing this and he is thinking, wow, there is my beloved Radharani. So he runs to that. But if you chant the name of Krishna, who then must come? Then Radharani herself comes. So in this way, Bhaktisiddhanta, he showed that actually this thing which is seen by other people maybe as mundane, we are always singing kirtan, they might say, here I have something new, I have something special, something to show off with. Bhaktisiddhanta was showing in that tried and tested simplicity, there actually is the highest conception. Not that he was telling his disciples, now you can jump in with this attitude that I am bringing Radharani to me, that you are so elevated. But he was showing that actually in the immaturity of approaching these things, in this immaturity, people will speculate and they will miss the point. Actually, the highest conclusions, the highest things will come through that conservative approach which Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur promoted. Again, not by showing all these external signs, but by simply proceeding. Because in a sense, he was making the point that it is better to please Krishna, it is better to please the spiritual master than even to glorify them. We can make all these glorifications and then say, I'm so close to Radharani, I'm so close to all these great Rasik Vaishnavas, and I'm glorifying, I'm saying all these things, they've understood all these high topics. But that is not maybe so pleasing to them. Maybe it is glorifying to them. But to please them, one should follow the set process, which again, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu did. Hundreds of times he heard Dhruva Maharaj pastimes. Hundreds of times he heard the Katha of Prahlad Maharaj. That is, of course, not to say then that anyone who is then tasting the higher things is to be condemned. We know there's a pastime of Vamsidas Babaji. Vamsidas Babaji, he was an avadhut, he was a paramahamsa, a great devotee. And he would sometimes do these pastimes on this high level, which sometimes people would struggle to understand. He would sometimes take his deities of Radha and Krishna and he would tie a rope around them and he would become upset with them because he had Vatsalya Ras, and he would start chastising Krishna, telling him to stop being a rascal, and he would throw into a river, and with a rope holding onto the deity, he would start speaking heavy words. And people would see this, and sometimes they would ask him for blessings, and he would just throw rocks at them. He would say, "These are your blessings, get away from me." And so a few disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, they saw this and they thought, here is a great Paramahamsa. Here is a great devotee. We should try and take his blessings. And when Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur heard this, he said, do not associate with Vamsidas Babaji. Do not associate with him. Do not go near him. And so they followed this advice well. They had some chastity, some understanding to the instructions, the Upadesh of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Having heard this, so they stopped. And then eventually they started saying, of course, he is a Sahajiya, this Vamsidas Babaji. He is showing off all these things. He is artificially on this platform. This is why Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur has told us not to associate with him. When Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur heard that this is the conception they were having, he became furious and he chastised them all. And he said, the reason why I have told you not to associate, not to have darshan, not to seek the teachings of Vamsidas Babaji is not because he is below you. It is not because he is false. It is because you are so below his level. You are so below the understanding that he is on that you will only commit offenses if you even try to approach him. It is not to say then that all of the higher things that people are experiencing, just because some people will fake it, doesn't mean it is all fake. We know there's the pastime of Dhenukasur. We know there was the wonderful pastimes of Krishna and all his Gopa friends and Balaram. And Balaram, he is feeling tired, so he rests his head on the lap of one of the Gopas. And Krishna, he massages his feet, and they're having a very sweet pastime. And then eventually Krishna himself decides he will lay down his head and relax, and he has his feet massaged. And at this time, relaxing in the fields, the Sridham, who was it? Sridham, Stota Krishna, no, yeah? And I forgot the last one now. They all came, and a few other Gopas. I could have just said a few other Gopas. A few other Gopas came, and they came. We know this is a very famous pastime. They came and they said, you know, there's this beautiful, beautiful fruit that is available. And in this forest, we all would like to go and taste it. We have heard it is so very, very sweet. But there is a demon there, Dhenukasur. And because of that, we are all afraid to go. Because any of us who wants to go, he will fight us away. We will not be able to taste the sweetness of this fruit. So then Balaram, he says, what to worry? I want to taste this. This sounds nice. I want to try this fruit. And so they go, all together, Krishna, Balaram, all the Gopas, and they go out to the forest. And arriving there, they see then all of the beautiful fruits, they are there. But there is Dhenukasur. And Balaram, he starts shaking the tree in order to take these fruits. And Dhenukasur, he becomes very furious. He's like an ass, like a donkey. And he goes and he approaches and he tries to attack Balaram. And as we know, Balaram swings him around and throws him, and he's done away with. He is killed. But we know all of the various demons in Vrindavan Leela, they correlate to various different obstacles in the spiritual path. It's a very popular topic. Bhaktivinoda Thakur elaborates on it on Chaitanya Shikshamrita. So, it is described then, what does Dhenukasur represent? At his heart, he represents avidya, or ignorance. That is what he represents. He represents the obstacle of ignorance on the spiritual path. But ignorance can take many different forms. There is ignorance of one's relationship with Krishna. There is ignorance on the true relationship of this material world. There is ignorance on the glories of the holy name. There is ignorance of one's swarup, one's form in the spiritual world. There's an ignorance on all sorts of things. So he represents these things. And the fruits high up in the tree, Bhaktivinoda Thakur would often say of the Sahajiyas that these great higher ecstasies, which here Mahaprabhu is embodying, they are like the fruits at the top of the tallest of trees. The Sahajiyas seek to only climb halfway, or not even climb at all, and they want to taste these sweet fruits. It is not sweet fruits that are at the bottom of the tree. And so they are only tasting material fruits, not these grand spiritual fruits. But these fruits here, they are representing those higher things. But Dhenukasur, he is representing that obstacle. So, because avidya, ignorance, doesn't necessarily mean a lack of jnana, a lack of knowledge. It also means a lack of vijnana, of realization. It is an emptiness of all those things, of jnana and vijnana. So if there is a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding of one's proper nature, or a realization of these things, it is one thing to know you are not this body, it is another thing to realize it. It is one thing to know you are Krishna Nityadas, it is another thing to realize it. It is one thing to know that the material world is not a place for us to enjoy, it is another thing to realize it. While all these things are there, then those higher fruits cannot be tasted. But so in that sense, that is representing one's own ignorance. But Bhaktivinoda Thakur actually describes that the ignorance can also be of another type of devotee. Because sometimes the devotee who is not able to taste these beautiful fruits, because he is ignorant that some people are able to taste it, because he is ignorant of the conclusions of the Shastras. By his ignorance, he becomes furious seeing people trying to taste the fruit, even if they are like Balaram, even if they are like the Gopas, who are qualified to taste these fruits. Even then he will see them and he will try to fight them off. He will say, no sadhu, this is too high, this is too high. And sometimes, because he is too much fixated, again, on criticizing other devotees, and also too much fixated on his own ignorance and misunderstanding of the spiritual path, he will attempt to get in the way. And then, of course, we know Balaram kills this demon. And Balaram, of course, is, as we know so well, Balaram is the Adi Guru. Balaram is always representing the Guru. So the Guru not only kills that ignorance, by placing Dibya Gyan Hriday Prakashito, by placing transcendental knowledge, by allowing one through his mercy to understand that Jnana and Vijnana. But also, he does away with those devotees who wish to not allow one access to the higher topics at all. Because access to those higher topics, Balaram was shaking the tree to bring those fruits, and then he was getting rid of the obstacle to them. That is given only through the mercy of the spiritual master. And that is why we are so fortunate with Srila Prabhupada's books. They are so perfectly presented as a gateway to all of these things. And not only a gateway, but they have within them that conclusion themselves. Many people will sometimes say, okay, I've read enough of Prabhupada's books. Now I will read the books of the six Goswamis. I will read all these rasic things. Now I can meditate on Lalita Madhava, Vidagdha Madhava. Prabhupada's books, that is for the lower levels. But I mean, we are studying Chaitanya Charitamrita. If studying this book, if one can still have such an idea, then what can you say? It's a lost cause. All of the highest things are here. Chaitanya Charitamrita is such a rasic text that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur in the Gauriya Math, they used to sit all and they would read through various shastras together. It would have been so wonderful to have been there. They would go through and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he would comment on various passages, various pastimes. They would read Bhagavatam together and he would give some meaning, some understanding of these things. But when they read Chaitanya Charitamrita, most of the time Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he would give elaborations. But especially like passages like the Gambhira pastimes and other elevated times, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would remain silent. The reading would continue going because they wanted to read the whole text. But he would remain silent so that unnecessarily they would not dwell on such elevated topics. If Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur felt that these were so elevated that even his intimate disciples he was studying Shastra with, it would be better that they would delay a study of such things, then how elevated could these topics be? Srila Prabhupada's books, in one way, they are the safe way to enter into these things, but they also contain all of these higher conceptions within themselves. I was listening to a seminar by His Holiness Devamrita Maharaj, and he was making this point, that actually even in Prabhupada's books, we will find many rasic passages that maybe we should not dwell on too much. He said, just because because Prabhupada has given a safe access point by which we can read these books, doesn't mean we can constantly dwell on them. And he quotes a famous pastime of Srila Prabhupada, where a few of Prabhupada's disciples, they were reading these esoteric pastimes of Krishna book on end, and they were only reading these things. And when Prabhupada heard of them, he said, you must stop this. And they said, no, but we want to taste the mood of the gopis. And Prabhupada chastised them very severely. He said, you are useless, you are rascals. This is not the approach. Who are you to suddenly jump in to thinking, I will only think as the gopis think? Such a high thing. So in a way, it's sort of like, I like to think Srila Prabhupada's books, it's like at the beach. They have the flags for where it's safe to swim. Prabhupada's books are like that. If we dive into Prabhupada's books, it is always safe waters. But that still doesn't mean that there isn't a depth on one end and a more shallow, safer water on the other end. Still, within the flags, you're in safe waters. And then maybe, as was said, the spiritual master will give some qualification for these higher things. The spiritual master will explain these higher things. The spiritual master will get rid of the ignorance which prevents one from getting in those things. But still, all of the depths of the ocean can still be reached within the purview of those flags. Maybe sometimes the spiritual master may guide, may request his disciple, you can maybe go a little bit out of these waters. For this purpose, I will give you this permission. But it is not guaranteed safety. We would need the expertise of a person who is able to swim well in order to explain to us that these waters are safe for you now. You are now at the point where maybe you can move out a little bit here or a little bit there. I remember one of my first real mentors in Krishna consciousness, His Grace Shastra Chakshush Prabhu. He used to be a pujari here in Sydney. He told me this once. He said, actually, there is no harm if every once in a while you are hearing nectar drops from the 10th canto or from other rasic pastimes. You know, they are sweet, and maybe every once in a while you will come across them. Do not be worried. Don't think you've ended your spiritual life. But he said, do not dive into them either. A few drops is not the ocean of rasa that is contained there. And until you can swim in that ocean of rasa, you will drown. This is what happens if we try to swim when we do not know how. And then he said, then that thing you are worried about, then it'll happen. Then you will drown. So these are very high things. I thought it would be a good preface before we read these 9 verses, because they're all coming directly from those very, very elevated sections of Shastra. So then, we know this. Then we can go on to the, with the few minutes we have left, we'll begin the discussion of how Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, what mood was he tasting? We hear that at Kurukshetra, he was tasting the mood of Radharani and the gopis at Kurukshetra. At Kurukshetra, as we were talking about, Kurukshetra is where the Madhurya Rasa is confronted with Aishwarya Rasa. The Madhurya, the sweetness of Krishna, the sweetness of Krishna, people who are absorbed in this idea, they are met with the opulence and the glory of Krishna. So we hear, though, however, in the Gambhira, not in Ratha Yatra, but in the Gambhira, there was a different mood. It was a mood of Srimati Radharani when Uddhav himself had come to Vrindavan. And in this pastime, not from Radharani's perspective, but from Uddhav's perspective, we see a reversal. We see somebody in the mood of Aishwarya, he begins to see the mood of Madhurya. It is the reverse, but we will find in both times the glories of the Madhurya Rasa is given, as well this will happen. It is not that when Madhurya enters into the element of Aishwarya, then Madhurya is shown to be the greatest. It is not that the reverse is true, that when Aishwarya enters into the realm of Madhurya, then Aishwarya is prominent. Because it has some contrast, it can be shown to be great. No, instead we will see that again, the Madhurya Rasa is the sweetest and most intense. Because, as we know, Krishna, when he left Vrindavan, he told the gopis and he told all of the denizens of Vrindavan, he told them, don't worry, I'll come back. As we know, he doesn't really. So the whole time, the gopis, they are struggling. In fact, it is the idea that Krishna says, he describes their position and he describes their condition. It'll be like they're suffering, like they're almost dead. Because Krishna knows they are on the verge of death. How can they live without Krishna? The only thing that would actually keep them alive is that hope, the words that Krishna gave, that actually I will come back. And so, knowing the situation of his devotees, he will resolve this with Uddhav. We will discuss that tomorrow. I went over time, but so tomorrow we will discuss how he plans to resolve that pain, and how that pain then ties into Mahaprabhu tasting the deeper moods of Srimati Radharani. Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Thakur ki jai. Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnav Vrinda ki jai. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya.